It's a pleasure to be here today. I've been asked to speak about why we need taxation, and I think it's an important point because often in these debates we talk about the burden of taxation, and it's assumed that reduction of taxation is always a good thing. Certainly that's what gets promoted by the business community, and very little attention is paid to the costs that are involved when we reduce or get rid of a tax. And so I think it's important that as we make these policy decisions, we are fully aware of what the costs are of undermining the revenue base of a country. And there are a couple of reasons for this, but a lot of them are based on myths, and there's not a lot of evidence that's injected into this debate. And so I'd like to just run over some of those issues. But before I do, as a way of framing it up, I'd just like to recall what Rutter Bregman said at Davos this year, and many of you may have seen the social media, but he essentially said that being asked to Davos to talk about inequality and poverty and not be able to talk about tax is like being invited to a firefighters conference and not being able to talk about water. He was attacked at one point by a leader of a large multinational from the US who said, look, this is just silly. Everybody knows that tax is bad for growth. Who has ever heard of a country, a high-tax country, that's had high growth rates? And what he said immediately, and this is because he's a historian and possibly not because he's an economist, he said, well, actually, the United States of America is a good example because in the 50s, the highest marginal tax rate in the USA was 80%. If you earned $1, you paid 80% in tax. And in the 60s, the highest marginal tax rate was 91%. Okay? Very, very high by today's standards. And in fact, these 2 decades were regarded as the golden years of economic growth in the US. Much, much higher rates of economic growth under those tax regimes than anything since as they've lowered tax. And I think that little exchange says a lot about the way in which we've come to internalise some of these myths about tax. But don't just take it from a historian. I've got a quote here, and I'm interested if anyone knows where this was published and who said it. It is, the public perception that large multinational companies pay little tax has led to political demands for urgent action. The call for a new approach is intense and with good reason. The ease with which multinationals seem able to avoid tax and the 3-decade-long decline in corporate tax rates compromise faith in the fairness of the international tax system. Clearly, we need a fundamental rethink on international taxation. Now, this was published last month. It's a recent quote. Does anyone know where it was published? The Financial Times, right? So, not noted for their sort of, communist views. And does anyone know who? Does anyone know who actually wrote that? No? It's Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, right? And so if the head of the IMF in the Financial Times a month ago is saying the corporate tax system is broken because corporations aren't paying enough tax, then I think I probably don't need to make too many more arguments as to why that's the case. She's much more qualified than I am. But why? Why is it the case? And one of the important points to remember is that tax is actually required for development. And if you track the spending of the 14 highest income countries over the last century, as they have grown, as their economic development has grown, what you find is their tax take correlates positively to the economic expansion. And if you correlate currently countries with high levels of economic development and compared to those with low, and then you correlate that against their tax take, it's a similar positive correlation. The higher the level of development, the higher the tax take. So there's very little evidence historically or currently that having a high tax take actually causes you to have lower economic growth. And there's some pretty good reasons for this. So the World Bank in 2005 issued a report that showed that when they looked at the reasons why multinational corporations invest, the taxation was not in the top 10 answers. It wasn't even in the top 15. I think it came in about number 16. The OECD, in a more recent survey, asked businesses, what do you look for when you invest in foreign companies? And again, tax came in not in the top 5, it came in about 7 or 8. But it wasn't the level of tax, it was tax certainty. Essentially, they said, look, you can put whatever tax rate you want. What we're concerned about is that it doesn't vary wildly over the course of our investment. What was interesting was that in the top 5 was stability in a country, skills, infrastructure, natural resource, and access to markets. Now, natural resources and access to markets, there's not a lot that can be done about that. If you're Nigerian, you've got 280 million consumers, you know, people want to sell stuff there. If you've got natural resources, people are going to want to come and dig it out. But the other 3, stability requires things like functioning court systems, good national administration, the ability to enforce contracts. Skills comes from the schooling system and the education system, again, largely a function of public expenditure. And infrastructure, if you look at how most countries have funded their infrastructure as they've developed, comes again from public expenditure. So of the top 5 things, the 3 things that governments can actually have policy solutions for all require tax revenue. And so the real question is how does it come to pass that we have these myths that abound? And a large part of it is that the discourse around taxation is largely dominated by vested interests. If we accept that in a society or a community or a country a certain amount of tax does need to be paid, then the question then is, who should bear the burden of paying those taxes? And you can see why in that context, those with power in the society would want to pay less and force the burden onto those who are less powerful, consumers and workers in the main. But also what we find is that tax revenue is highly correlated with the solution of social development issues. And there's a discourse going on at the moment that says that the private sector can fund this equally as well. And the reality is, for a whole bunch of social policy issues, it's just not the case. And I'll just give one example before I conclude around the health system. If you take countries like Belgium and the USA, which have similar gross national income per capita and similar public spending on healthcare, it's about 8% of GDP. It's unremarkable they produce similar rates of life expectancy. But Belgium has only 2.7% of GDP in private spending, compared to 9% in the USA. And despite the massive extra amount of private finance for health in the USA has almost twice the rate of infant mortality. Right? So what this shows is that there's a major misallocation of resources in the USA, where a lot more money is going into the private healthcare system and not producing much better outcomes. It's a misallocation of resources. And it's not just an economic issue. This diversion of funds costs lives. And so recent studies showed that without altering the total healthcare spending in the world, if we took all of the private healthcare spending and put it into public healthcare spending, we could avoid nearly 5 million child deaths per year. But you would need to be able to find the revenue for that. You would have to actually tax it in order to spend that money. And when you look at how that happens, the results are really quite stunningly simple. Basically, whilst healthcare systems are complex, the basic flaws of private provision are shockingly simple. Cost of user pays creates barriers to access services for those who need it. And commercial incentives encourage people to spend money on stuff they don't need in the private healthcare system. And in the US, a 2012 report shows that $750 billion a year is misspent in the US health system. Now, that's more than the entire Pentagon budget, to put that in perspective. And it's more than enough to give every American who doesn't have healthcare access to healthcare. Most of the waste came from unnecessary services, $210 billion annually, excessive administration costs, 190 billion annually, and inefficient delivery of care, 130 billion annually. And so that's just one example that shows that the private sector, firstly, often doesn't provide the funds necessary, but even when they do, the public sector spending on sectors like health is actually far more efficient. I'll wrap up just by saying that tax policy is essentially a political question. If we accept that there's a certain amount of revenue required by governments to fund development, to fund social policies, to fund healthcare, to fund education, to fund the police, to fund the courts, to deal with climate change, then the question is how is that distributed? And when you debate tax policy and you hear a whole lot of myths, like the myth that was suggested when I started about the fact that nobody's ever heard of a high-taxing country that has high economic growth, the question that I'd urge you to ask is, in whose interests is this argument being put? And in whose interests is this tax policy being promoted? Because the tax codes of most countries are often just a chronology of the most powerful vested interests over the course of history. The people who get the exemptions, the people who are able to remove taxes, the people who are able to avoid taxes are usually the most powerful people in that society. And a very famous economist once said, if an alien was to come to Earth and approached him and said, can you quickly give me a sort of a rule of thumb as to who's got the most power in your society, what would you say? And he said, I would just say to them, find out who is taxed, because the people that get taxed in society are generally the people who have the least power. Finally, though, I'd like to make one point on tax competition, because tax is often presented as a race to the bottom, that the lower is the better. What we know is that in any given country, if any given employer or any given business would like lower taxes, that's clear. But if, and they say it would help their business, but if you lower tax rates for everybody in that industry, in fact, it doesn't create more efficiency. The cost base for everybody decreases, and the same's for countries. A country can lower its tax base, can get rid of taxes, and it may well see in the short term an increase in competitiveness. But all that happens is that the country next door has a decrease in competitiveness. And ultimately, the country next door, if they want to compete, is obliged to lower their taxes to the same level. And so if what happens is everybody ratchets down, nobody has got an increase in competitiveness. All that's happened is that corporate taxes across the board have decreased, and the tax burden has shifted to those people who are unable to pay that tax. So you will hear that lowering taxes increases efficiency, but that may be true in the static sense, but in a dynamic sense, all that does is contributes to a race to the bottom. And what we find is, as we had here, is that it's the people with the least power who pay the most, and it's the countries who are least developed who suffer the most. And so I urge you to consider all of this as you consider the way in which taxation in the digital economy affects all of us. Thank you.